Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of interviews with spiritually awakening people. I've done 499 of them now. That's what this one is. And if you haven't seen others and would like to, go to batgap.com, BATGAP, and look under the past interviews menu where you'll see all the previous ones archived in various ways. This program is made possible by the support of appreciative listeners and viewers. So if you appreciate it and feel like supporting it, there is a PayPal button on every page of the site. And that little sentence I just said is just about the only thing we do to raise funds. We don't like to make a big fuss of it, but the support is appreciated and is essential. So my guest today is Giovanni Densman. That's right pronunciation. Giovanni, some sirens going in the background here. Giovanni is a spiritual practitioner and teacher and the creator of Live and Dare, one of the top 5 most visited meditation blogs on the planet, as far as we know on any planet. As an author, meditation coach, and speaker, Giovanni helps people overcome anxiety and stress to live a more calm and centered life through spiritually inspired personal development work. So having read that sentence just now, it makes it sound like it's one of these sort of, that he's offering a sort of practical, down-to-earth, benefit-oriented approach to spirituality, which very often doesn't even involve the word spirituality. People meditate and do yoga and stuff to deal with stress. But Giovanni himself is very deeply spiritually motivated and has been since the age of 14. Spirituality has been the center of his life since then. And in his journey, he has practiced over 9,000 hours of meditation and counting, tried 70 different techniques, and nearly became a monk twice. When you say that to people, Giovanni, that you've tried 70 different techniques, do you get accused of digging a whole lot of shallow wells instead of one deep one?
When I talk to spiritual practitioners, yes, they feel like, some of them will feel like, why have you tried so many? Don't you get one and focus and go deep into that one? But when I'm talking to people who are approaching meditation as a practice of healing, of growth, for the other non-spiritual benefits of the practice, then they appreciate, okay, this guy has practiced different techniques, so maybe he can help me find out which one is best for me.
Yeah. I think that, it's different for different people, but for some people, maybe it's a really good idea to shop around and try a bunch of different things and then settle on 1 or 2 or 3 that really work for you. And how would you know which ones work unless you've tried a number of them?
Mm. And in the past, this was never possible because it wasn't available. All of these paths are not available. The guru that you meet, the guru of your town or whatever, the religion that you were born into, those are the methods and the techniques that you'll be exposed to. But nowadays we have all these books, all these masters, all these videos, and we can learn about all these paths. So while I recommend people to find one meditation and one path that works best for them and really focus on that, unless you expose yourself to many practices, it's very hard to find the right one for you, in my opinion.
Yeah, when I first learned back in the 60s, there weren't that many things around. There was TM, which I learned. There was Zen. I went to a Zen center once in New York City, had my car towed away, spent the night sleeping in a car storage lot. That was an adventure. And there was Guru Maharaji, the 14-year-old perfect master. And there was Silva Mind Control. And there was Yogananda's technique, this SRF. And not much more, just, at least that I was aware of. These days, obviously, with the internet and everything else, there's a huge supermarket full of things that one could potentially do. It might be a little overwhelming for some people. Where do they start? What do they do?
Yeah. Well, and of these techniques, all of the ones that I try, they are traditional techniques. So many of them are from the Tantras. There's the book, the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which teaches you 112 different meditations. So many of them came from that book.
Mm. Yeah, I remember hearing about that back in the 70s, that it was said that there were that many different ways to transcend, and theoretically you could try them all. I suppose on this topic, people are going to maybe try different things, and then at a certain point they're going to do something, and it really works for them profoundly, and then they think, okay, that's the one for me. Has that been your experience?
In certain phases of my journey, yes. So in the very beginning, one of my first paths was Zen Buddhism, and I almost became a monk there. And at that time, I was only practicing Zazen. So I didn't care about any other teaching, any other technique. It was only Zazen. But then when I moved on from that path, and I think we might zoom into that later on in the interview, when I moved on from that path, then I went to the path of Ramana and Advaita. And then when I moved on from that path 10 years later, then I was like, okay, let me check what is out there. And that was the phase of my life that I experimented all these techniques before I focused on another one.
Yeah, and the first thing you got into when you were about 14 was occultism, wasn't it? No, you went to some meditation group, didn't you? And did some kind of meditation, and you really liked it. And then you go ahead, tell the story.
Yeah. So it all started with me reading Paulo Coelho, right? My mom had his books, so I read his books, and I got fascinated with this idea of the mystic, the occult, the esoteric. And so I started reading about anything that I could find in Portuguese, because I was born and raised in Brazil. Anything I could find in my mother tongue about religion, philosophy, occultism, Kabbalah, all of that, I was reading like crazy. And many of these books, many of these paths, they recommend meditation. So when I got to know about a workshop that was being held in my city, which was by the Brahma Kumaris group. So I went there for a 1-hour introduction to meditation, and there was maybe a 10 minutes guided meditation. And that experience was very special. And for the first time ever in my life, I was happy and at peace in the present moment. Nothing to run after, nothing to run away from, just happy inside my own skin. And I was a very restless teenager and child. So that experience was unique. It was something that I've never had before. And when I had the experience, I said, like, okay, I'm going to continue practicing meditation every day in my life. And that was the beginning. I continued practicing meditation. I continued reading a lot, first about the occult. That was my interest. I had a strong fascination for the siddhis, the supernatural powers and that type of thing. And for the next 2 to 2.5 years of my life, that's how the journey went. Until little by little, I started realizing that what I'm after is not power, it's awakening, it's enlightenment. And when I started realizing that, then my path began to shift. There were 3 paths that were calling my attention at that time, which was the path of Zen Buddhism, the path of Advaita Vedanta, and the path of Taoism. And I felt like, okay, so far I have been studying and reading and trying to practice all these things, but I feel that it's better to dig 10 meters in a single direction than 1 meter holes in 10 different directions, right? So I felt this need to decide and choose one path and then dedicate myself fully to it. And because I got to know of a Zen master that lived in my city, in Soto Zen, the Zen master is called Roshi. And later on, I discovered that actually he's quite big. Like from the Soto Zen tradition, he was the main one for the whole South America. He was responsible for the development of Zen in South America. And he lived in my city, Porto Alegre in Brazil. So when I found about him and I started going to his Zen center, then I felt like, okay, let me choose this path because I found a master and it's speaking to me right now. And I made it my path. It was interesting, the day that I went to Via Zen to meet him, there was no one around. And it didn't come to me that I had to go in specific times. I just went in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, and he was alone there. So I had this chance to speak with him at length. And I asked many questions. And one of the questions was, have you achieved nirvana? And he said, yes, that's what it means to be a Roshi. That's what it means to have received the Dharma transmission. And then I felt, wow, I'm in the presence of an enlightened being. This is great, right? So that's how it all started for me in Zen.
Cool. And from what I read of your bio on your website, you really got into it, gung ho. You've always been the type to really get into this stuff whenever you try it out. You're not just a dilettante, which means a superficial dabbler. You just go in, full head first and deeply into it. So you were doing lots of Zen, and you actually you assumed some kind of a leadership role or significant administrative role in that group, even at a very young age, probably under 20 still, right?
Yeah, so I was 19. I shaved my head. I went to the monastery in France because he has a disciple that runs the monastery in France. And I went there twice for 5 weeks each time in my winter break from university. And I mean, everything about me was clear that my whole life is about Zen, right? And my parents were really freaking out, even though I hadn't seen anything, but they know like every weekend I am in the Zen center, Friday night, Saturday night. And if I'm at home, I am doing Zazen in my room, or I am reading about Zen, or I am taking care of the admin tasks of the Zen center. That was, apart from university, that was my life, right? And my parents were freaking out.
They should have been relieved. I mean, what were other people your age doing at that point,
Exactly, drugs and other things.
Yeah.
But they didn't. They wanted me to be normal,
right?
They didn't want me to, like, what is the Zen thing? At that time, meditation was not even popular. Nowadays, if you say I practice meditation, people admire you. Right? At that time, it's like you're kind of a weirdo. So yeah, I was really close to that master. And one day after a retreat, after my first retreat, it came to me the idea. I felt so great. I felt so peaceful. I felt so connected. And then the idea came to me like a lightning. Why don't you make this every day of your life? Become a monk. And that idea came to me without any questions attached to it, without any hesitations. It was just kind of like a flash of insight, something that is dropped into you. And I immediately accepted it. I said, like, yes, that's actually what I want. And then I went to talk to my Zen master, and he was not so impressed, but he just said, okay, you finish your university. Because I said, like, should I quit everything and begin now? He said, no, you finish your university. At that time, I was doing law, and there was more 4 years. It was in the very beginning. So he said, you finish your university, and by then, if you still want it, then you can become a monk.
And you also had a girlfriend at the time.
Yeah, I also had a girlfriend at the time, and immediately I told her, look, this desire has come in my heart. Should we break up, or what should we do? And she said, no, let's continue for now, and we'll see what we do by time. So that's how things developed, and I became closer and closer to the Roshi. And like, for me, he was my link to the Zen tradition, to the Buddhist tradition. In Zen, there's this strong idea of the lineage, that the Dharma has been passed from generation to generation, all the way from the Buddha to the Bodhidharma, and then going to China, and then going to Japan to Dogen Zenji, and then going to Moriyama Roshi in Porto Alegre. So it's like, wow, it's such an honor to be his disciple. So I lived like that for about 2 to 3 years. And then one day when he had traveled to Japan, I got a phone call from a very close female disciple in the Sangha. And she said, do you have the phone number of Roshi in Japan? I would like to talk to him. I said, yes, I have. Here's the phone number. And then I said, I noticed that you haven't been in the Sangha anymore lately. What's happening? She said, yeah, I'm not feeling comfortable about it. And then I said, is it the Roshi? I don't know why the idea came. Is it the Roshi? She said, yes. Okay, what's the matter with the Roshi? Well, I don't think I should tell you. I mean, you are the closest disciple, the most dedicated one. So in a way, you should know, but if I tell you, it's going to affect your life. So I don't know what I should do. So we talked for half an hour, and I convinced her to tell me, what do you think I should know? And she said, well, Roshi is my boyfriend. So what do you mean Roshi is your boyfriend? I said, Roshi is my boyfriend. I'm his girlfriend. Just like any boyfriend and girlfriend relationship.
How old was he and how old was she?
At that time, he was probably 60 and she was probably 45.
Oh, so not too big of an age difference, but anyway.
Yes, yes. I said, but he is a celibate monk. How can you be his girlfriend? Anyhow, so I pressed her for more information, and we were kind of close friends, and she shared everything, right? So I said, so who is paying? Like when you guys go out together, who's paying? Is it you or him? I said, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's him. Okay, so the donation money that we are giving to sustain him, he's using to date you as well. So all of these things started coming up in my mind, like this. I was just confused. I didn't know what to make of it. And then, so we talked for like 2 hours, and we hung up, and I said, like, I don't know what to make sense of this. I'm just going to sleep and let things come clear by time. So little by little, and another important point is she said, I think I'm not the only one. And I asked Roshi specifically about this, and he said, no, you're the only one. So now I think that there's another girl that she's also the girlfriend of mine. So then the following day, I went and called that other person, who is also my friend. And I said, look, this has come to my attention. Is it true that you are the girlfriend of the Roshi? She said, no, that's absurd, etc., etc., etc. Okay, we finished the call. And then I started thinking, like, okay, so maybe that other person, she is making things up or misinterpreting or fantasizing, I don't know. But then I got a phone call back and saying, like, no, I'm shocked, but it's true. I'm also the girlfriend of the Roshi. So that for me was a big disappointment. I was not angry at him, but I was disappointed because who I thought he was not. You know, if he was another type of teacher, it's different. But if he is a Roshi, he's a monk, so he cannot act like that. And he can. Not only did he transgress the vow in Buddhism that you, as a monk, you should not have sexual intercourse, but he also lied to both of them about them being the only ones. So that for me was the beginning of the end of Zen. And I called him. After that, I actually called him Japan. And I said, look, person A said that she is your girlfriend. And I didn't know that. And I said, okay, I see. That's all. I have no reactions. And I said, and she said that you told her that she's the only one. I said, yes, there's only one. And and then I said, but I talked to this other person, person B, and she said that she's also your girlfriend. And she said that you told her she's the only one. So you lied. And I said, no, what? Me and her speak, only me and her understand. That was his answer. And I said, well, she didn't understand. She didn't understand because she's confused also. So anyhow, long story short, little by little, I shared the news with the members of the Sangha. And to my great surprise, most of them, even though they were surprised and a little bit disappointed, they said, no, but still Roshi is my master. He's a great man. I'm going to continue following him. And for me, that was absurd. Like, it doesn't matter what level of realization he has, but his behavior does not match the behavior of a monk, and actually does not even match the behavior of a lay Buddhist practitioner, because you take the 5 vows, and one of them is not to lie, and the other is not to misuse sexuality. So, yeah.
There's a larger issue here, which, you know, has been discussed quite a bit on BatGap, and which is related to the Association for Spiritual Integrity, which I helped found, formerly called the Association of Professional Spiritual Teachers. And that is the whole issue of whether there is a correlation between higher consciousness and ethical behavior. And we don't need to spend the whole interview on it. Some people are tired of hearing about it. But, you know, some people say there isn't. And you could be you know, alcoholic, womanizing scoundrel and yet be enlightened. And when I hear that sort of thing, I say, well, that's ridiculous, because I mean, it renders the term enlightenment utterly meaningless, and that enlightenment has ramifications for all aspects of life, including your behavior. Just to name one, but that's a big one. That's an important one, and you just couldn't be behaving that way and be in any significantly developed state of realization. And to buttress that argument, we could refer to so many different ancient traditions which have all these codes of ethics, like Patanjali and the Buddhist codes and everything else that do in fact say that there is this correlation, or should be, and that ethical behavior is not only correlated with or a symptom of higher consciousness, but it's conducive to the development of higher consciousness. And that if you're misbehaving in those various ways, then it renders the mind and physiology more impure, less pure. And that is not conducive to realization, because mental and physiological purity it's essential in terms of honing the instrument, fine-tuning the instrument, so that it can be a fit vehicle for higher realization. Anyway, that's my little soapbox spiel on that. I imagine you agree.
Yeah, and I think we're going to go into the topic of Neo-Advaita soon, and then we can discuss that more in depth.
Okay.
Yeah. So from that point onward, later on I traveled to Japan because I had won a scholarship to study Japanese in Japan. And when I was in Japan, I actually sent a letter to the Roshi. And in that letter, I gave my rakusu, which is the thing that you sue the moment that you are becoming a disciple. Like, it's a very symbolic link. It's like the wedding ring, right? But for the tradition.
It's like a physical article of some kind?
Yeah, so you wear that whenever you wear that around your neck whenever you are practicing. And that has the name of your master, and that is like the formal link with the tradition.
So you mailed it back to him, did you?
Yes. So I wrote him a letter saying, among other things, I said, I'm deeply disappointed at your behavior. You criticize a lot that Buddhism is decaying, but your behavior is part of the decaying Buddhism. And here is my rakusu. And it was a bit longer than that, but that was the gist of it. And so for me, there was a closure. There was a closure with the time of Zen. And when the path of Zen was finishing, then I was like, okay, what am I going to do next? Enlightenment is still the most important thing in my life, but what is going to be my path? What is going to be my master? Who's going to be my master, and what's going to be my practice?
Let me ask you a question here. Did you ever have a moment or a brief period where you began to doubt that there was such a thing as enlightenment because you kept being disappointed by various supposed examples of it? Or did you always sort of put those things in perspective and realize that, well, this person is a work in progress, but enlightenment is a real thing and I still want it?
I think I started thinking like that. I started questioning. But then I immediately went back to the teachings of the ancient masters, like the Buddha or Bodhidharma or Ramana, Krishna, Yukteswar, all of these great masters. And because I had read so much in my journey and already been exposed to different paths, that was not the be-all and all for me. So if I didn't have that background, and I think that's what happens with many spiritual seekers, they don't have a strong background in spirituality, in the study and understanding of different traditions. And the only way of spirituality that they know is of that master they are currently seeking. So if they discover something about that master or they get disappointed with it in any way, they may just become cynical about the whole spirituality thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just want to throw in a point here on that, which is that I think there's a tremendous value in knowledge as well as experience on the spiritual path. And a lot of people don't emphasize that very much. In fact, I've had people say to me recently, well, forget about all these dead masters and all these quotes and all this stuff. Just go by your own experience. But if you go by your own experience, it's really easy to get mixed up, because how do you interpret your experience? you know, it's like knowledge safeguards the path, and it actually enables you to appreciate the experience more if you know of its significance. For instance, there's an old example of, let's say you pick up a stone by the road and it's kind of shiny and you think, oh, this is cool, and you put it in your pocket. Now, you don't realize it because you don't have the knowledge, but it's a very valuable diamond. It's quite a large, valuable diamond. But you just think of it as a shiny stone, and maybe you even throw it away after a while because, you don't know what it is. So, having a clear understanding safeguards the path.
Yeah. And comes to mind now a quote of Confucius that I'm, of course, paraphrasing, but he says, there are three means of wisdom: by self-reflection, which is the noblest; by imitation, which is the easiest; and by experience, which is the most bitter. So yeah, you can throw away all the knowledge, you can throw away all the experiments that other people have already done for centuries before you, and they have written down their conclusions and their insights. You can throw all of that away and start from zero based on your own insight and your own heart and your own intuition, and you will progress. But it's going to be slow and it's going to be bitter. And if you can instead, it's like a scientist. The scientist doesn't start science from zero, like everything that was already learned and discovered before him, that's the ground on which he stands.
Yeah, Sir Isaac Newton said, I stand on the shoulders of giants. And science works by consensus. Scientist doesn't just say, okay, here's my idea. If he does, he presents something, all the other scientists jump on it and say, okay, we'll test it, and they poke holes in it, or maybe they find out more. But there's this sort of group effort that builds the body of scientific knowledge, and also safeguards that, to use the word safeguard again, safeguards it from misinterpretation and misunderstanding and false conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know what you mean, because I have heard that type of argument a lot. A lot of people in the spiritual path, they kind of shun reading and studying, except in Tibetan Buddhism. In Tibetan Buddhism, that is a huge part of the tradition. But if you think deeply, that doesn't make much sense, because the ancient masters, the enlightened masters, the ones that have achieved, that they are at the end of the path that you're walking, like they have achieved what you want to achieve. Some of them wrote books. Right? So if that was useless, why would they have written books?
Yeah. And it might be argued that, they wrote in an ancient age where we don't have all the understanding that we have in this contemporary age. But, there's a saying, that which is closest to truth lasts longest. And the stuff they were writing about is truth, capital T, and therefore it should be timeless. And obviously there could be issues with distortions as things are translated and retranslated and passed down, sometimes just orally for a long time before they're even written. There's that kind of issue, and also this person speaks from their level of consciousness, and listeners can only hear from their level of consciousness, so translators might garble it up. But nonetheless, there are a lot of gems in these ancient traditions. If we, I don't want to talk too much, but I just want to add that it's good to have a sort of not a skeptical attitude, but a questioning attitude. The Buddha said this too. He said, don't just accept something because I said it, or go by your own understanding, your own experience. But he didn't say don't listen to me. So with all these books and all, we don't need to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say they're all just mythical nonsense, nor should we say, oh, it's absolute gospel truth. If it said that, Hanuman the monkey flew to the Himalayas from Sri Lanka and brought a mountain back and all, we don't necessarily have to accept that actually literally happened. Maybe it did, but questionable. But there are teachings and gems sprinkled throughout these books that can be very valuable.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes we can be in front of a master and sit in satsang, but sometimes we can't because the master is far away or the master has died a long time ago. And then getting a book with the teachings of that master and really reading it and going deeply into it with an open heart, that is the second best thing to it. It's a form of satsang. In a way, you can get that energy. Like when you read I Am That from Nisargadatta Maharaj, or you read the works of Ramana. I've never met any of the two, but it's almost as if you're sitting in their presence. The energy comes through the words.
Good. Okay. And just one more point here, and I will continue on, and that is that, we have different faculties, and experiential realization is not really, it's an exercise of our intellectual faculty. It's more it's non-conceptual, but we also have the intellectual faculty, which deals with concepts. We have the heart, which deals with feelings. And there's no reason why all these different faculties shouldn't be employed in the process of spiritual evolution and shouldn't be developed as we go along to be more and more effective in enabling us to, progress.
Yeah. So typically we speak of the four paths, which is the path of jnana, the intellect, the path of raja, meditation, path of bhakti, devotion, and the path of karma, which is action. And then usually they say the path of tantra, it's more like the path of energy. So people who are more heart people, they will feel more attracted to the path of bhakti, devotion, right? People who are more heady, they will feel more attracted to the path of jnana. But at the same time, I like what Swami Shivananda used to say, that we need to develop the yoga of head, heart, and hands, something like that. So integrating all of these aspects, because as a human being, we have to act. As a human being, we think, and there are illusions in our thoughts. So reading the books and reflecting on the teachings help us to get rid of those illusions. And we also have a heart, we also feel, so we need to purify our heart as well.
Yeah, and some people might be more predominant in one or another of those things, but no one is exclusively one of those things to the exclusion of all the others.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is, by my own nature, I've always been more into the jnana yoga path, the path of the intellect. And in several sources, I've seen masters saying that the jnana yoga path is the hardest one, and it's only for most advanced seekers. And me, in my own arrogance as a teenager or in my early 20s, I say like, yes, that's the one for me.
Yeah, because I'm cool. I'm special.
I can do this. Right? And the more I walk the path, the more I see like, okay, I'm not really ready for that path, even though I have walked the path for a decade and I've had an experience of awakening, which has been a point of no return for me. Still, I see that I may need another lifetime of purification of the mind and making myself sattvic and developing other qualities that other paths emphasize more before I can really get that path and go into the end.
That's interesting that you should say that. I believe Shankara said something of that nature, that jnana yoga is for kind of a small percentage of people, and that these other paths are conducive to various aspects of purification to ready one for the jnana yoga path, if that is going to be one's ultimate path, which it may not necessarily have to be for everyone. I mean, yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So after I left Zen, I kind of fell in love with the teachings of Ramana, which I had read in the past, and that became my path for the next 10 years, the path of Advaita, and really having Ramana Maharshi as my guru, as my main kind of source of truth. And then I also read and got inspired by Nisargadatta Maharaj, Papaji, and Muji. But just to speak to what you just said, at that time in my life when it was just the path of jnana yoga, just the path of self-inquiry, right? I felt the technique to be very, very effective. The technique of, through the question, who am I? Removing the attention from everything that is external, including thoughts, feelings, memories, all of that is external, to the pure sense of I am. I found it very helpful and very powerful.
You were able to do that easily?
I wouldn't say that I was able to do that easily, but even in the beginning of my path, I was having better results with that than with 3 years of Zen.
Okay. Was it easy for you to switch from Zen practice to this new one, or did you find yourself falling back into the habit of Zen meditation the way you had been doing it?
It didn't happen like this. It happened slowly. So I was doing meditation twice a day at that time. So I said, okay, I'm going to be doing Zazen at night and I'm going to be doing self-inquiry in the morning. And then little by little, Zazen started disappearing and self-inquiry dominated. But at that time in my life, that self-inquiry and Advaita and the path of Jnana Yoga was the main thing. I was very disconnected from the body, from emotions, and that had an impact in my relationship with my wife, for instance, and in other areas of my life. So,
as a result of Zen?
No, as a result of Advaita.
Oh, that made you disconnected. Okay.
Yeah. Because whenever an emotion arises, if you ask who is the one feeling this emotion, and then you drop the emotion and you dwell in the pure consciousness that is emotionless, so by time I realized that that type of path, if you want to go really deep and hardcore as I was going, it's easier if you are alone or a renunciant. And in the past, only people who were sadhus or monks were following that path. And people who were in the world, they were following paths that were a little bit easier to integrate to a more active life. And that took me 10 years to realize that. I don't say that people in the world should not follow the path of Advaita or Jnana Yoga at all. It is very powerful. And if you have that inclination, a person should absolutely follow it. But at the same time, you need to bring in other practices that are going to fill the gaps. And you need to know that this type of practice and this type of teaching was created by monks for monks, in a way. In the past, only monks were following it. So you're going to have to translate that into your daily life. You're going to have to bridge that gap rather than try to apply it literally to every situation.
Okay, good. Incidentally, I wanted to just mention that those who are listening live, I forgot to say this in the beginning, if you want to ask a question at any point, there's a form at the bottom of the upcoming interviews page on batgap.com. And if you submit your question through there, it'll come to me and I can ask it. Okay. So, so you did the Advaita for about 10 years. I think you mentioned that Lakshmana Swami was one of your teachers. Is he a living Swami in the tradition of Ramana?
Yeah, so Lakshmana Swami, I think he's still alive. He was 25 when Ramana Maharshi was in his last year of life. And there is a book called No Mind, I Am the Self by David Godman, who has been in our show. And I read that book and I felt like, well, this is a real guru, a real jnani. There's no doubt about it for me. And he is alive, and there's a chance that I can meet him in India. And in the teachings of Ramana, he speaks a lot about the guru. And while many times he says that the guru is the self, the real guru is the self, he also says that if you can be in the presence of a physical guru, that is very, very helpful, right? So I felt like, okay, my only chance, the only one that I know that is alive in this lineage is Lakshmana Swami. And at that time, it was December of 2006. And he was already 80 something. And I just graduated from university. I had to actually beg them to graduate me a month before everyone else so that I could be there for the darshan. And I was there. There were about 30 to 40 people, and there was a lot of Shakti, a lot of energy and peace in the environment. And
was it in Ramana Ashram?
No, there's about 3 blocks away from Ramana Ashram. He has his own, it's in his house basically. He has a big garden, and that's where the darshan is held. And to give a bit of context, in the lineage of Ramana and also much before him, it says that initiation, which is called Diksha, can happen through word, through touch, or through darshan, through the sight. And Diksha is something that for many Westerners may be a bit hard to understand. It's a transfer of energy. It's a transfer of grace that actually empowers you to be able to follow the path and to do the technique effectively. So I wanted the darshan of Lakshmana Swami to be connected to the path more deeply and to get that grace and that Shaktipat that would allow me to practice self-inquiry. So I was there in his darshan, and I was sitting in the 5th row, but I could barely hear him because he speaks such a low tone of voice. But even if I had heard just a sentence, his presence was so powerful that something's happening inside of you just by being in his presence. And I've met many teachers, a couple of gurus, but I've never felt that with anyone else. It's quite extraordinary. And one of the sentences he says is, surrender is the easiest path, and effort is needed, but grace is also needed. And grace is more, I think he said something like grace is a more predominant factor. He said, surrender to the Lord within. Surrender to the self within the heart. And when he said that, on an act of complete surrender, I did exactly that. By the power of his grace, I looked inside and I surrendered the ego in the heart. And something happened there. It's hard for me to explain what happened, but that was the first point of non-return in my life, in my path. The presence of the guru has made the ego dive into the heart, into the self. And of course it came back, but it was not the same. It was lighter, it was more transparent. And there was a kind of a grace helping me, pushing me in the path. So I really consider that an initiation into Advaita. That's how I felt. So that was, after that I could see him a few times, because he would go inside a car every morning and go around Arunachala doing the circumambulation, which is kind of a sacred practice. He couldn't walk, so by car. So I would see him, and it was always very powerful to be able to be in his presence, and sometimes our eyes would meet. So that was a very powerful event in my path.
Okay. And then I have a list of the teachers you've studied with here, and the next one that comes up is Shiva Rudra Balayogi, who's been on Bat Gap.
Yeah, so before that, it was Muji.
Oh, before Shiva Rudra.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, Shiva Rudra Balayogi, I got to know of him in 2005, the same year that I was going into Advaita. And we exchanged a couple of emails, which for me is strange, like a yogi is answering an email to a random visitor on the website. But I felt like, okay, this man is also self-realized. And I felt like I could take him as a guru, but he self-realized more in the path of Raja Yoga, like really, really hardcore tapas, meditation, multiple hours a day, etc.
Yeah, he did a lot.
And I was attracted more to the path of Jnana Yoga, of self-inquiry. So he was always someone that was on the back of my mind that I admired as a teacher and had some connection. But for the next 10 years after that, until I met him again, it was mostly the path of Advaita.
Okay. And then who was Nikhilaneshwarananda? You mentioned that here.
Oh, yeah, that comes much after.
Oh, okay. I'm getting them mixed up.
Much
So
after.
you just keep telling your story. I won't try to guide you along. And we'll get away from your story into all kinds of specific considerations and topics as we go along here too. Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had read everything of Ramana that I could get my hands into, like maybe 30 books. So I really felt I understood how Ramana is teaching and what he is about. And then when I went to Tiruvannamalai that year to meet Lakshmana Swami, then after that, I also walked around there were many satsang teachers around. I think Karl Renz, Premananda, there were like many of them. I don't even remember their names. But I was going to their satsangs to kind of check it out. And I was like, wow, it sounds like Advaita, but it's not really Advaita. And that was my first introduction to the world of New Advaita. So I continued going to the other satsangs. Just going once to each teacher was enough for me, just to really have a feel of like, how are people teaching it in this path? What are they recommending? What are they emphasizing? What are they missing? Just as an exercise to develop my own discernment into the teachings. And later on, I realized that this is like really, really popular. It's the most common way that Advaita Vedanta is being taught, is through the lens of New Advaita. And a lot of that is because of a great master called Papaji. Papaji was a disciple of Ramana, and he attained enlightenment with Ramana. and he was very hardcore, very true in my own reading. But his way of teaching was emphasizing non-effort. It seems to me that his whole teaching was optimized for getting a person to where they are, to that first experience of the self, as quickly as possible. And for that, it's not going to be a decade of meditation that's going to do it. It's another type of teaching and pointing. And he emphasized a lot non-effort, letting go of everything, dropping everything, and just being quiet here and now. And if you're able to do that in the presence of the guru, with the guru's grace there, kind of helping you, then you may have an experience of the self. But then what happens is, from that point, many people think that that's it, because they don't have that background, that spiritual study, that spiritual background. They haven't really studied the teachings of Ramana, and they think that that's it. And then they become satsang teachers. And that's how Neo-Advaita happens.
Yeah, you have a good article on your site about Neo-Advaita. I've read Timothy Conway's whole article, and you quote that. Timothy's been on Batgap a couple of times, but your article lays it out very nicely. I already sent it to somebody who told me they didn't know the difference between Advaita and Neo-Advaita, and she found it very, very helpful. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about what Neo-Advaita is and how you came to the conclusion that maybe it's not what Advaita is cracked up is supposed to be.
Yeah. So Ramana said a couple of things that helps us to understand and navigate this world of spirituality. One of them, he said, is there's an experience of liberation that many attain and very few go beyond. Right? I'm paraphrasing from memory, so words may be slightly different, but the import of it is exactly this: that as you practice self-inquiry, as you are on the path, you may have an experience of the self. And this experience may be temporary, or in some level, it may be a point of no return in some aspects. But it's very easy to get stuck there and to feel that this is it. And from now on, I just have to continue being this. And whatever needs to happen is going to happen. And my actions can only be the actions of God, or they must be always right because they come from the self and there's only the self. So that type of thinking starts coming. Another thing that Ramana says is, in the presence of the master, samadhi can occur. But for it to be fully integrated, further effort is required. So Ramana spoke very clearly about the need of effort. He said, as long as there are vasanas, which are our desires, our fears, our prejudices, our thought patterns that are automatic and unconscious, as long as these things exist, you still need further effort to abide and dissolve in the self.
Yeah, I wrote down several quotes from your book, or copied them. Here's one. Even though the self is the only reality, there's a clear instruction that spiritual practice is essential. Ramana continuously emphasized that only a ripe mind will be able to easily find liberation. For all other seekers, a long period of drying up through purposeful spiritual practice was needed, according to Ramana. And here's one from Nisargadatta. There are so many who take the dawn for the noon, a momentary experience for full realization, and destroy even the little they gain by excess of pride. Humility and silence are essential for a sadhaka, a seeker, however advanced. Only a fully ripened jnani can allow himself complete spontaneity.
Yeah. I'd like that quote to be pasted on the wall of all satsang halls.
Yeah.
So that is Neo-Advaita. Neo-Advaita is mistaking a temporary realization for the full realization. It ignores a lot of the key elements of the teachings that has ever been there in the Advaita. One of them is the idea of ripeness of mind. So Ramana used to say that there are three classes of students or seekers. There are ones that they are like dry wood. Sorry, ones that are like wet wood, ones that are like dry wood, and others are like gunpowder. Right? So the ones that are like wet wood, they need a lot of practice and drying up, as it says in the quote. So they are ready for the truth. The ones that are like dry wood, they need less practice. They're closer. And the ones that are like gunpowder, they come in the presence of a master and they just achieve the final, irreversible, ultimate realization. And the trick is most people think that they are on level 2 or level 3, right? But most likely they're not. I mean, the level 3 is people like Papaji, people like Muruganar that came in the presence of Raman and achieved enlightenment. You can say that even people like Lakshmana Swami, he was probably in category 2, like he was a dry wood, because he did decades of pranayama and japa, practicing mantra by himself for years before he went to the Ramana and had the awakening. So what I found in my own journey is that the more I study the teachings, the masters, the tradition, the more I see how long this path is and how far away, in a way, full realization is. So that you really need to be humble and you really need to follow the path and the teachings and the practices that you need right now to take the next step in your life. It may be self-inquiry. It may be dealing with your anger. It may be reviewing some negative self-beliefs. It may be learning to concentrate the mind through practicing mantra or tratak or anything. But we need to have a greater clarity over what the path really is. And this is a multi-life project. It's for most people, it's a multi-life project. And you may be blessed with an experience of awakening quite early on. And that is a blessing. And that's the beginning of the journey, it's not the end.
Yeah, I'm totally in agreement with you. Not everyone is, as you know. And I think some of the objections people bring up to this type of talk is, one is that, well, spiritual practice only somehow reifies or increases the sense of a practicer. So it makes the ego even more, solid, because there's a you who is doing something, and the whole point is to sort of get to transcend the notion of a you that does things. So how would you respond to that particular point?
Well, Ramana understood that point quite well. He said that very well. Every practice enforces a sense of ego because it is practiced by the ego, by the I, the individual I. But he, Ramana, who also understood that, said that practice is essential.
So why would he say that if it reinforces the sense of an I?
Well, he also said that it's useless to just remain inactive in regard to the path of realization and active in regard to everything else in your life. Like you say, like, okay, doing a practice just reinforces the ego, so I'm not going to do it. But you're doing all sorts of other things in your life that are also coming from the ego. There's a metaphor of using a piece of stick to move all the other stick into the fire. And then when all the wood is in the fire, then you throw that one last. But if you throw that one before everything's on the fire, then you have no means to burn all the other wood. Right? The path is many times described as crossing a river from samsara to nirvana, right? From ego to self, from individuality to consciousness. But to cross this river, you need a boat. And if in the middle of the journey, you say like, hey, no one on the other side of the river has a boat, right? And I'm going to have to give up this boat anyhow. So let me give it up now. If you do that, you're left with no other means to move forward. You're probably going to drown.
Yeah. 1 second here. Okay, so that's a good metaphor. Ramana was also fond of the saying, it takes a thorn to remove a thorn, Like ultimately a practice might not make sense because of the reasons people raise. There is no practicer, or you're only going to reinforce the sense of a practicer. But at a certain stage, that might be just what you need. I mean, sometimes even people accuse practice of being like a crutch. But if you have a broken leg, you actually could use a crutch. It helps you until the leg heals, and then you can throw the crutch away.
Yeah. Otherwise, it might never heal.
Yeah.
Right? Nisargadatta said this, that you cannot leave a mess and go beyond.
Interesting
You
point.
cannot leave a mess behind and go beyond, right? It's almost impossible to go from a very tamasic ego, from a very kind of gross, exteriorized, materialized ego to no ego. You might be able to do that jump occasionally for a short period of time, but your psyche, you don't have the structure to just stay there. You're going to be pulled back.
Yeah. And you've heard the term spiritual bypassing, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
right.
Yeah. So that what's happened. They have that experience, okay, and then they say, "Well, this seems more true than all that mess that I'm leaving behind, right? So I'm going to affirm this, and I'm going to deny that." So spiritual bypassing is based on denying where you are, not being honest with yourself, not seeing things clearly. In Zen, they have this saying, which is attachment to emptiness, which is also known as the Zen sickness, right? And it's very hard once that's why they spoke against it, because it's very hard once you get that experience. Like some people would just feel like saying, this is it. I am the self. There is only the self. I've seen it. So everything else must only be an illusion. So why should I work to change any of that? It doesn't make any difference to the self. Yeah, and it doesn't make any difference to the self, but it makes a difference to the self in manifestation, which is who you are right now, whether you recognize it or not. You're the self in manifestation.
Yeah. There's another saying, I think it's the Chandogya Upanishad. It says, into great darkness go those who worship ignorance. Into even greater darkness, as it were, go those who worship knowledge. And I think what that means is that, this sort of fixation on the absolute view to the exclusion of relative considerations such as practices or ethics or any of that other stuff can get you into hot water.
Yeah. And they also say that a truth misunderstood causes much harm. And the higher the truth that is misunderstood, the higher is the damage. And maybe that's why in the past, if you wanted to learn Advaita, you couldn't buy a book in the bookstore. It doesn't work like that. You would have to serve a master for 12 years. And in those 12 years, he's not teaching you Advaita. He's teaching you humility. He's teaching you to let go of the ego. He's teaching you the precepts, how to learn, how to be in the world. And he's teaching you more basic practices such as pranayama, japa, etc. And at the end of 12 years of preparation, of self-purification, if you are deemed worthy, he will teach you the ultimate truth. And that truth will land on a very different mind than the mind that it would land on 12 years ago.
Yeah. If anybody's listening to this and they disagree with the things that we're saying, go ahead and send in a question and I'll ask it, because Giovanni and I are pretty much, birds of a feather here, but we're open to hearing reasonable objections to what we're saying. And you can see how people kind of don't like this line of talk because it sounds like a lot of work. I've got to spend 12 years doing what, and before I reach, and there's a sort of a resonance effect, I think, that takes place when you read a lot of Ramana or other, beautiful spiritual books. You kind of entrain, if you know that word. You sort of tune in to what it's saying, and it actually does sort of lift you to a higher state as you're reading that. And you can, if you read enough of it, you can actually come to feel that you've got it. It's the world is an illusion. I am that, and there is no person, and there is no free will, and all these kind of concepts. You kind of get them ingrained into your psychology. But I have a feeling that in most cases, it's a far cry from what the experience could be if one were really living that and not mistaking an intellectual understanding of it for the living of it.
And it can be really hard to make that shift, because as we can learn from the way Papaji teaches, ignoring all the effort, ignoring all the preparation, ignoring the ego and the mass, and just trying to be here and now, letting go of everything and keeping quiet, that can lead to an experience that is extraordinary. It's a milestone in the spiritual life that is very significant. But then moving forward to that, it's not doing the same thing again and again and again and again that is going to help you. Okay, now you have seen it. You have seen the truth. Okay, now there's still a gap between how you're functioning as, or there's a gap between consciousness functioning as the ego Giovanni or the ego Rick or the ego whatever, and the pure consciousness. There's a gap, and I may be wrong, but I don't think that gap is going to be crossed by just going again and again and again, trying to go again and again and again to that experience. Or maybe it will, but it will require a very specific type of mind that is very strong and that is able to hold on to that. And, Ramana said that self-inquiry begins when you hold on to the self and you are beyond all thoughts. Begins. Right? So most people would say, like, okay, I have done very little self-inquiry then. So if self-inquiry only begins, then we really need to be humble about what we're doing. We are in the preparation. We are in the path of purification of the mind. And it's very clear, Ramana also said that only a sattvic mind, a pure mind, can grasp the truth. So if your mind is not sattvic yet, and you had an experience of the truth, then your path now should be to make the mind sattvic.
Yeah, I think in a way, some people might be scared off by the word effort, because the thought of having to sit for an hour or two a day doing something effortful doesn't sound very appealing, and having to do that for years on end before you get anywhere. My own experience, and I think yours might be similar, was that from day one, the experience was so enjoyable that effort really is not a relevant word. And in fact, what I learned to practice actually didn't involve effort, and it was explicitly instructed not to use effort, but to just sort of be very natural and effortless with it. But it was so gratifying from day one and I was not a very disciplined person. I had dropped out of high school and everything and got arrested a couple times, but it was easy for me to stick with because it was so enjoyable. It was self-motivating. It was like, eating a delicious piece of food or something. You want it. You want to keep eating it because it's so good.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So that is a very important point, a very important shift, because if you can learn to enjoy your practice, then you will continue doing it.
Yeah, like anything.
Right? It's deeply ingrained in our system, in our brain, in our biology, that we'll avoid pain and we'll seek pleasure. So if you can find pleasure in your practice, if you can find an immediate benefit in your practice, not the enlightenment that may happen 7 lives from now, right? But some immediate benefit and enjoyment, then you will continue to practice. Then it will not be a struggle. It's just like, it's just part of my life. The more I do this, the better I feel. So why would I not do it?
Yeah, exactly. And also when you say enjoyment, if we compare it to sensory enjoyment, there are a lot of sensory things that you can enjoy, but you get sick of them after a while. But the kind of enjoyment we're talking about here is not like that. It doesn't get you, disgusted through repeated experience. It actually becomes more and more charming.
Yeah. But most people would say, look, a spiritual practice, I kind of feel calm and centered after that, but it's not really enjoyable. A lot of the times it feels like work. Looking at my shadows and working through all of this mess feels like a lot of work. But if you understand that this is the best thing that you can do for yourself right now, not because maybe in the future you may have awakening, but if you feel that right now, the more you follow these teachings, the better you live, then you will continue, even though sometimes may be difficult and painful.
Yeah, no, that's good to emphasize too, because if we make it sound too rosy, then it's not realistic, because there's, you mentioned purification. If purification is going to occur, there's going to have to be release of impurities, and release of impurities can be rather an unpleasant process while we're going through it.
Yeah. And in some paths, like the path of Bhakti Yoga, which is the path of devotion, the seeker kind of falls in love with a version of the divine, right? Okay, you're back now.
Continue.
So the seeker kind of falls in love with a version of the divine. in India, at least, it usually has a name and a form. But that is just like an icon. It's not that God is that name and form. The name and form is something that you use to focus the mind and the feeling towards God. Right? But the interesting thing about this path, which is not a natural path for my own inclinations, but a benefit of it is that because you're falling in love with a version of the divine, there is a sweetness to it. Right? So it's kind of, there's an enjoyment to it. The more you love and are devoted to the divine in a form, the more you feel that enjoyment, right? So that is something to be said for the bhakti path that can make this transition easier.
Yeah. There's a principle here which I think might apply to any path, which is that all beings have a natural tendency to want to seek a field of greater happiness. You know, whether it's a dog chewing on a bone, or you know, a person falling in love, or you know, if we're sitting and talking and some beautiful music comes on, our attention effortlessly shifts to it. There's just this natural innate drive that all beings have to seek a field of greater happiness. And the thing we're talking about here is traditionally described as being the greatest happiness, you know, bliss, ananda, you know, happiness beyond any relative sensory experience. And so any step in the direction of that, if it's a genuine step, if we're really moving in the direction of that, should result in some greater happiness. And that's, in a way, that's the litmus test for whether it's a valid step or not. And so if it does, then as you were just saying, it's self-reinforcing. You know, we just sort of naturally get into the groove of continuing to take steps in that direction because it pays off as we do.
Yeah, and if you think about it, lately meditation has become quite popular and quite mainstream, right? And meditation is only one of the several practices in the spiritual path. I even wrote an article, The 76 Benefits of Meditation. So there's scientific research proving that meditation is good for all sorts of things.
Oh, yeah.
So if you meditate daily, you spend the rest of your life meditating and you never achieve any experience of awakening, okay, let's say worst case scenario, still you have lived much better than if instead you spend that half an hour or 1 hour a day watching Netflix.
Yeah, I mean, chances are it may lower your blood pressure and improve your brainwave coherence and do all kinds of things, you know, that are good for you. I mean, you know, these days stress is a big deal, and depression is a big deal. I mean, most of people in the United States are on some form of antidepressant. And so even if it were only these mundane benefits, as you just said, it's a great thing to add to your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then looking at enlightenment as a north, right? Not as a hard goal, not as something that I have to achieve, but a north.
A north.
Something
what do you mean by that, north?
It's where I'm pointing to. It's where I'm walking towards.
I see.
Yeah, it's my direction.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's my direction in life. It's not something that I expect to arrive at anytime soon. It's just where I'm walking towards. And then if you have that attitude, it's much less likely that you will feel disappointed at how much work there is to do and how much far away you are from that ideal. Because no, it's just the direction I'm walking towards. And then if I can enjoy my path as I'm going, and if I can see benefits in other areas of my life, and if part of me can sometimes even enjoy the practice, then why not? Is there anything better to do?
Yeah. You sent me a bunch of points, and I want to start going through them because these are interesting, and each one of them is a springboard to something we can talk about. But we've already talked about a couple of them with regard to your journey, but there was also an important stage in your journey with Mooji. You had an awakening with Mooji. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Okay. So at that time, it was a time in my journey where I was practicing self-inquiry compulsively. It was always there for me. Any thought, any emotion, I would always kind of, not any thought, it was a bit exaggerated, but any emotion that would arise, I would immediately ask who is the one perceiving this and kind of dissolve it back into the self. And doing that multiple times a day.
24 hours a
day?
Yeah.
For emotions, yes.
Didn't it kind of divide your mind to do that? Or?
Well, by nature, I'm not a very emotional person. So there are not that many emotions. But emotion is something that is very close to the ego. It's something that is very ingrained in the ego. So for trivial thoughts, I wouldn't bother so much. But when an emotion arises, then I would ask that question. And then, of course, also in my 1 hour a day that I'm only doing that. And then I was also watching Mooji satsangs at that time, like maybe 2 hours a day. So I was really doing as much as I can to dive into that truth and to experience that. And then what happened is in February 2010, I was in Tiruvannamalai. And at that time, Mooji used to walk around the mountain with a small group of devotees early in the morning. And after a walk, we would sit in a chai shop and there was a spontaneous satsang that would occur. Maybe we were like 20 people. And in one of those days, before that, let me just come back a little bit and say, I also had some experiences when I was meditating as if like I'm going to die. I'm going to completely disappear. Because that's what self-inquiry is doing, right? It's Sadhuon calls it an ego suicide, right? It's so, but when you actually are close to that, there is this fear that arises, right? And by nature, I'm not a fearful person, but this fear arose in the middle of meditation. And then I thought, I have lived as an ego, as an individual for many lifetimes, like all of us. Like, I want to go forward with this. And if it's going to be the disappearance of me, let it be. I'm not going to be afraid. Let it happen. And I feel that releasing that fear like that, it never came back anymore. That kind of prepared the ground. So in 2010, I was having that, I was in Tiru and I was having that walk with Mooji, and then we sat in a chai shop, and then we were all quiet. And he started the satsang by saying, "You are the absolute awareness." And that is a sentence that is a very Advaita sentence. It's a sentence that Mooji had said multiple times, maybe in every satsang in one form or another, he says that. But that time, that sentence went through me completely. And it was as if the eye of consciousness had blinked and the whole universe had blinked out of existence. And for an instant, there was only the self-aware. And then it blinked back into existence. And I was like, I didn't know what had happened. It was just silence. It was something very different from what I had ever experienced. Something had dropped. Something had dropped. I didn't know what it was. And then I was quiet, very, very quiet inside. And went home, went to the morning satsang. And in the afternoon, I had an interview with Mooji. Because Mooji had asked me a few days ago, he had mentioned kind of casually, like, I would like to be interviewed by someone that asks really good spiritual questions. That time he hadn't been interviewed by you yet. But, and I said, okay, Mooji, if you like, I will come up with some questions that can be helpful for the great majority of seekers, and I'll interview you. And I said, okay, I would love that. So I had prepared those questions like beforehand. And that afternoon was the day that I had to have that interview with Mooji. So we went out for that interview, and I was already in that altered state. And there were maybe 5 or 6 students around Mooji, me and other 5 or 6, very small. And as I'm going through the questions and asking the questions kind of on behalf of everyone that could be watching that interview, at a certain point, Mooji looked at me and said, all these questions are good, but they are not your questions. He's saying, I am not being pulled to answer powerfully because they are not your questions. I said, yes, Mooji, you asked me to ask on the behalf of everyone. He said, no, but Mooji was saying, I need someone that comes to me and he's powerfully wanting to be liberated. And then at that time in my mind, the thought came, okay, let me try to do this one more time. And with all my being, I kind of tried to reawaken that feeling like, okay, I want to be liberated. That's all I want, 100%. Liberate me now. And then as I was trying to do that, I realized that I couldn't. It didn't make any sense. It would be to create a fake sense of I in order to be a seeker, for that I to then be dissolved.
So you'd already kind of moved on from this intense seeker energy, and you didn't want to whip it up again.
Yeah, I tried, but it just wasn't happening. That psychological structure wasn't there anymore. So I just couldn't. I couldn't play that role for Mooji. But I feel that something in him got triggered. Like maybe he felt that and he responded to that. And soon the satsang finished, and after the cameras were off, we were all kind of sitting quiet, silence, and then Mooji began to speak. And at that time I had already watched dozens of satsangs of Mooji and been in dozens of satsangs of Mooji, but I had never seen him speak the way he was speaking at the end of that satsang with the cameras off. It was coming from a different place. And there was a dense silence in the room. And he continued speaking like that for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. It's like he was channeling the absolute. That's the feeling I had. And after he left, like the five of us, we just continued there in silence. And a couple of people came to me and said, "Thank you for these questions. I've never seen Mooji like that." And I said, "I've never seen Mooji like that either." Unfortunately, the cameras were off at that time. But that was the day that a big shift happened in me. And I had no idea what had happened, and I had no desire to understand it. Over the next few days, I was just spending hours and hours in my room, laying down on my bed, staring at the wall, doing nothing, just kind of being empty and silent. And just going out for satsang and for meals, basically. And I went to Mooji and I said, "What's happening? Mooji, I'm in this state and I'm just hours and hours in nothingness, looking at the walls." And he said, "And I am busy talking to people and running satsangs. Can we swap bodies?"
That's pretty good.
So that was it. There was a sense of I knew that something had shifted, and I had no idea what it was, and I had no desire to understand it. But in the next months in my life and the next years, I was just kind of marinating into that and allowing that to reveal itself. And intuitively, I know that this is not the end. This is a powerful milestone, but it's not the end. So I continued doing my self-inquiry. I just had no more inclination to be a seeker or even to read anything about spirituality. And it continued like that for about 4 years. And that was the same time that I moved to Australia. So it was good that I was not into that spiritual thirst anymore, because I needed my energy to make things work on the external world with the migration and new career, etc.
What is your career? You have a career outside of meditation stuff?
Well, so at that time when I moved to Australia, I started becoming a programmer. I taught myself programming and made a life as a programmer for 5 years here before I then quit the job. And I'm doing this full time now.
Okay, good. So in light of your beautiful experience with Mooji, what do you make of what's going on these days with Mooji?
So I saw that article. I didn't read it line by line, but I skimmed through that article that came out about a month or two ago. And I don't know if those facts are true, if those things that they say are true about his involvement with other women, etc. So I cannot judge him, and I don't wish to judge him in any way. The only thing I can do is share my own discernment about this. And I think every seeker needs to develop their own discernment in the path. And that discernment is about themselves, but it's also about the teachings and the teachers, so that they can find at every moment what really speaks to them. And my discernment was empowered by the framework of the Buddha, of the 4 levels of awakening or enlightenment, right? So in level 1, there is the experience of non-self, right? So there's a drop of the identity. That's just level 1, right? In level 2, then the desire and fear and aversion, they greatly diminish. In level 3, they are overcome. And then in level 4, all forms of desire, pride, attachment, etc., everything is dropped. So looking at this framework, I understood that what had happened for me was level 1. And I later spoke about this experience with a couple of Buddhist teachers that have been in your show, by the way. And they said, like, yeah, that sounds like level 1. So I said, okay, so if what happened to me is level 1, then where is Mooji in the scale? I felt like, from my understanding of the Buddha's teachings and Ramana's teachings, I feel that he's in level 2. So in level 2, desire, fear, and aversion are greatly diminished, but they haven't disappeared. And if they haven't disappeared, there is chance that, moved by these poisons of mind, the seeker, and he's still a seeker at that stage, the seeker is bound to do certain things that are not conducive to his further growth and to the growth of the Sangha if he has already taken a teaching role. So I don't know exactly what happened in the Sangha. I don't know what Mooji did. It would not break my worldview if all of those things were true. I mean, it would break my worldview if those things were true about Ramana or about Buddha, right? Yeah. But about Mooji, seeing him within this larger spectrum, it wouldn't break my worldview. So I think those things might be true, and I think Mooji is a master that I'm deeply grateful for Mooji, because it was because of him that I could have that experience. And I'm sure that other people have had similar experiences in one level or another. And Mooji continues to serve the seekers out there. But when you understand the deeper context of things, then you understand, like, okay, Mooji is not a perfected master, right? And if he's not a perfected master, then he may do things that are not helpful to you as a student following Mooji. And therefore, you need to keep your discernment alive. You need to keep the eye of consciousness kind of alive. Not suspicious, not cynical. Like, if you take Mooji or any of these masters as your guru, there should be a certain level of trust and surrender. But at the same time, you should keep your discernment alive. And when your discernment says that some things are not right, then that doesn't mean you need to leave that master, but you just see him within a bigger context.
Yeah. It seems to me that any really good teacher is never going to tell you to discard your discernment, your discrimination. In fact, they would probably encourage you to use it. They would have an attitude of, ask me anything. If you have doubts, air your doubts. I don't mind. I can deal with it. I don't know what the scene. I can't comment on what the scene might be around Mooji in that regard, but I think that that's a healthy attitude. And like you say, that kind of attitude doesn't contradict the notion of being trusting and kind of innocent. You don't have to be a cynic and doubt everything, but just to sort of be honest about what you know and what you don't know, and to feel comfortable asking about anything that you don't know or that might trouble you, because that's how doubts get dispelled, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of interesting and polemic points in what you said. The first is, so if you think that if the master hasn't achieved that final ultimate awakening, he's still a work in progress, right? So he still has shadows. So if he's still a work in progress, he still needs to be practicing something to keep purifying the mind and growing, right? But the trick with New Advaita is that there's this concept that all practice is illusory and the search is illusory, and you should give up the search. And I wouldn't really classify Mooji as not New Advaita, but there are some traces of New Advaita in his teachings, just as there are traces in the teachings of Papaji, which is a master that I absolutely respect and think he's there level 3 or 4. But because there's that idea that there's no need to practice anything, that all comes from the ego, which seems to me to be the story that Mooji is kind of promoting to himself and others, I'm not sure how much self-reflection will happen to change certain things. So if the teacher knows that he's a work in progress and he's acting like a work in progress, that's better.
Yeah. Yeah, some of the teachers I respect most, like Adyashanti and Shakti Katarina Maji and others, they always say that, that I'm a work in progress. They never try to give the impression that they're finished and that they don't have anything more to learn or grow into.
And Shankara, that was another framework that was very helpful for me, was what Shankara said about full awakening or realization. He said that there are 3 obstacles. There's ignorance, there is impurity, and there is dissipation of mind. Ignorance, impurity, and dissipation of mind. And Neo-Advaita works only in the ignorance part. Right? So at the end of that path, you have less ignorance or you have no ignorance about who you are. But because there's still impurities in the mind, in the form of vasanas, and there's still dissipation of the mind, your mind cannot, right? Then that realization is not permanent. And unless you address those 2 elements, it's not going to be.
Yeah, I would also question whether you could really actually be totally clear on who you are, the first point, if there are vasanas and impurities, because, sure, you could have glimpses. I'm sure you could have glimpses, but I have a feeling that the vasanas and impurities would, and the sort of the agitation of the mind would prevent a really genuine, clear, stable self-realization. They just wouldn't allow it. So chances are, if you've dwelt a lot on Advaita principles but haven't taken care of the purification, that you're going to end up mistaking an intellectual understanding for realization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's part of the preparation that would happen in those 12 years that the disciple would go through before they try to. That's the thing, it just became clear now as I speak. They would leave the ignorance, the final ignorance about the ego, to be tackled at the end. Because if you tackle that at the beginning, there's the risk of happening what happens with Neo-Advaita. They just said, okay, the ego is an ignorance. Why? It's an illusion. Why should I do all those other efforts? But if you have already gone through that, you have already purified your mind, you have a mind that you can stay still on a single point without distraction, then that truth becomes clear to you. Then it does the magic.
Yeah. And some people might think it's odd that there's this tradition of secret teachings and you don't get the higher teachings until you have progressed through all these different stages. But I think we've kind of addressed it here, and that is that a teaching that could be extremely helpful at a certain advanced stage could actually be harmful at a more preliminary stage, because you're not capable of understanding it, and it may confuse you, or you may end up misapplying it in some way.
Mm-hmm. And that depends on the discernment of the teacher or the seeker to know, like, am I there to do that type of teaching and practice or not? And it's hard. Sometimes we're going to misjudge, and the more spiritually mature we become, the better is going to be our conclusion about these things. Until then, we're going to make mistakes and judge that we are in one point that we're not.
And of course, in these days, all the teachings are out there, so it's not like you can have them fed to you spoon by spoon as you progress. It's like you can look at them. But the Advaita is part of Vedanta, and Vedanta means the end of the Veda, and the end, means like the kind of final teaching. But it doesn't mean that all the previous teachings of the Veda are irrelevant or useless. They all have their function in leading you up to the point where the end teaching is germane, is relevant to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another point that you mentioned that I myself question a lot is, because you said no real teacher would ask you to let go of your discernment and be like 100% blindly devoted. From my study, I see in a lot of Indian traditions, apart from Buddhism, in a lot of Indian traditions, the Guru Bhakti, the devotion to the Guru, is so emphasized. It's like such an important element. And in many texts and traditions, you even say them saying things that, like, you have to give yourself up to the Guru and have no personal preference, no personal like the guru, whatever the guru says is an order. There's no questioning, there's no hesitation. If the guru has flaws, you don't look at it because that's going to be unhelpful for your own growth, right? So those teachings exist, okay, and they are there, and they are traditional, and they are dangerous, but they're also true in my point of view.
Yeah, I agree with you, actually. I mean, I think in probably a small percentage of cases that might really work, and generally speaking, it would be a case where there's a close personal relationship with the guru, and perhaps you're living a recluse lifestyle, you don't have all kinds of other worldly responsibilities, and you could just become like an iron filing around a magnet, that just sort of is stuck in the immediate orbit of that guru. But boy, that's 1% of the cases. The other 99 have been cases of abuse.
Yeah. And that's something that for the West, that doesn't work. I would never promote these ideas. People that are ready for them, they will come and get to those ideas by themselves. But the other important point is that only works with a 1% of the gurus also, not only 1% of the. So I wouldn't do that with a guru on a level 1 or 2, because there's still a chance that they still have desires and aversions and vasanas, etc., on a certain level that may still be harmful for you, right? And there are very few gurus that are that elevated that you can actually practice that safely.
Yeah, I don't think I can name one. And if I can name one, I don't think he's asking people to do that,
Yeah.
And so if anybody asks you to do that, chances are it's not one of those ones that you should trust with it. And so run the other way.
Yeah, I would probably agree.
Yeah. A few good questions have come in. Let me ask you a few of these questions. Here's one from Nikola Svetkovic from Belgrade, Yugoslavia. I think it's a woman. She asks, how can one function in the world without ego? Many scholars have the interpretation that the world only exists from the point of view of the ego.
From my understanding, a level of ego is always retained, even after realization. The metaphor that Ramana uses for this is that it's like a burnt rope. It still looks like a rope, but it cannot be used to tie anything. So your ego will still function like an ego. On some levels, on some very sattvic, rarefied levels, it will still function like an ego, as long as consciousness is embodied. But it cannot tie you anymore. It's cleaned up. It's harmless. And if it's not harmless, it means that there's further work to be done. And for everyone else, for all of us on the path, I would say that the priority shouldn't be to think of destroying the ego or overcoming the ego, but rather to purify the ego, to move from a tamasic and rajasic ego to a more sattvic ego.
Yeah, I've heard various people say that you can really, if you're going to drop the ego, you can actually really only drop a healthy ego. So you can't drop one that's weak and impure. So there really has to be a lot of strengthening and purification before you can think about becoming egoless.
It's like the question, how can we cross the river without the boat? Now you use the boat until the very, very moment. When you can jump out of the boat and land on land, then you're good.
Yeah,
then you're good.
Yeah. Here's a question that came in from Aaron Morton from Dunedin, New Zealand. Aaron asks, how important is the role of self-inquiry together with devotion? I guess the idea is, can the two of them go hand in hand?
I think it can. If in your inclination, in your heart, you feel that they're both helpful for you right now, then practice them both together. After I've been with Lakshmana Swami, that darshan experience, my path for a while became more of a self-surrender path rather than a self-inquiry, because that's what he taught, surrender to the self in the heart. And at that time, they were kind of happening together. So yeah, they can be done together.
Okay. So there's a section of the notes you sent me. There are like 6 different sections, and I think we pretty much, well, actually, there's one that we didn't cover yet in section 1 of your notes. You mentioned yoga and tantra, and then you talk samadhi, mantra, and Tratika. I think everybody knows what samadhi and mantra mean, and even maybe what tantra means, and yoga. But what is Tratika?
Trataka is the meditation practice of gazing.
Gazing, okay, like at a candle or at the wall.
It's usually done at a candle, but it can be a dot on the wall. It can be the moon. It can be an object. It can be a photo of your guru. It can be anything. And the purpose is to concentrate the mind. So I think the context for that note is, as I kind of had that awakening in Advaita, when the search reawakened for me 4 years after, why didn't I go back to Advaita? Well, it's because of that understanding from Shankara's framework of the 3 poisons and the Buddha's framework of the 4 levels of awakening. I realized that what I need most in my journey right now is the ability to purify the mind and concentrate the mind, like remove the dissipation of mind. And there are a lot of things in the Ramana teachings that says the same thing. And then I thought, okay, what of all the methods of focusing the mind, of all the methods of concentration, which ones are going to be most helpful for me? Is it going to be to focus on the I am, which is like the most subtle of all subtle things? Or no, probably according to the yogis, you start by mastering your mind, focusing on things that are more concrete, like a mantra. Mantra is a sound, right? It's kind of concrete. Or something that you're gazing, that's concrete.
Yeah, have you ever done mantra practice?
Yeah, so nowadays mantra and Trataka are my main practices.
Okay. Where did you get your mantra?
I got initiated by a tantric guru in India, and he gave me mantra.
Okay, good. Okay, a second section of your notes is about the gradual versus direct path. And I think this is interesting. I hosted a panel discussion at the Science Non-Duality Conference on this very topic. And so I'll go through some of the points that you wrote down. We can talk about them. One is, you say, your first point, maturity bias of the masters. What does that mean?
Okay. So this is something that I have realized that helps me put things in perspective in the path, is that masters like Ramana Maharshi, that they are at the top, when they teach, it's like they were like us so many lifetimes ago that they have lost that context. So what I've found in
studying what it's like to be us,
to be a beginner, right? So yeah. they can see us, and maybe some masters can even read our minds, but sometimes the teachings and the practices, the advices that they give require a level of strength and purity and that we just don't have.
I see.
So it seems to me that the more, with some rare exceptions, the more advanced the master is, the kind of more hardcore will be the teachings, and the more difficult it will be for the great majority of seekers to really, you will need something to bridge the gap. While teachers that are more closer to us in terms of maturity and progress, they understand better what it is to struggle with what we struggle, to be where we are on the path. And they can give things that are more, maybe more concrete and more helpful for that next step that we need to give.
Yeah. There's a saying in India, which is that when the mangoes are ripe, the branches bend down so that people can easily pick the fruit. And I think it's possible, for a teacher to be very high and yet to have the flexibility to teach at all kinds of different levels, so he can sort of meet people where they're at. In fact, Ramana was somewhat famous for being able to do that. He would say different things to different people according to their orientation, their aptitude, their level of development. But it's an interesting point. Obviously not. I started teaching meditation when I was 21 years old, and I remember one time I was teaching. I've been meditating 2 or 3 years, and some guy said, "I want to be like you," and I thought, what in the world would you want to be like me for? I'm kind of a beginner. I just have this ability I've been taught to teach you this systematic thing. But it's like, a kid goes to school, first grade, comes home, and his little sister says, what did you learn? And he said, well, I learned A, and I learned B, and I learned C. And she said, oh, what else did you learn? He said, well, I'll tell you to borrow after I go back. So we can teach something, even though we may not have the highest teaching, we can be of value.
Yeah. And that's the point in this understanding of that the advanced masters may have a maturity bias. that means that there is a space for other teachers on the path that are less developed to fill in that role. Because if I don't know basic arithmetics yet, and I need to learn arithmetics, I don't need to go to the PhD of mathematics.
Right. It's going to be a waste of his time and yours.
Yeah, maybe he can teach me. I'm sure arithmetics very well, right? But maybe that guy who teaches arithmetics, and that's all he teaches all day long, he's on that level, maybe he knows how to teach that part better for people that are on that level. And the reason why that was important for me is I always wanted to go to the highest teaching and the most advanced master and the most direct path. And I realized that sometimes that's not what's most helpful.
It's a good point, because some people complain about all these teachers out there offering satsang to little groups and offering webinars and all that stuff. And they say, well, there's so few teachers that are really grade A teachers, like Ramana and Papaji. But I think we're in a time where it's appropriate for there to be like armies of teachers running around able to teach to a certain niche, a certain group. In fact, when I became a teacher, one of the things that Maharishi Mahesh Yogi said to us was, he said, when there's a war on, there's no time to train sharpshooters. Just give them a gun and send them out. And so he gave us some basic instructions on how to teach, and we're just like kids basically, and sent us out, and it had some effect.
Mm. Yeah, so it's just important to keep in mind that the best teacher, the best path, the best practice for you is what is helpful for you to give the next step.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, I think we've covered that. So we've covered some of these other points in group one of your points. What do you say, what does this one mean? The high standards of the yogis, and then you have Shiva Rudra Bala Yogi in parentheses.
Yeah, so that's again about the maturity bias. So Shiva Rudra Bala Yogi is someone I have spent time with, and I've been in his ashram in India, etc. We were kind of close for a certain period of time. But he and his master, Shiva Bala Yogi, say that meditation is when you can spend at least an hour without a single thought arising. If you cannot do that, you're trying to meditate. You're not meditating.
Right. So that's going to be pretty frustrating to the average person who hears that instruction. They're going to think that
is the most demotivating thing I've ever heard. And you know what? I dug a little bit and I asked other disciples and other devotees, including the Ambaji, who she's the one that has been with the Shiva Rudra Bala Yogi from the very beginning. Can you stay an hour without a thought? Just focusing here, which is where the teaching is, the practice. He said no, and I don't know anyone who can.
Good. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a big disconnect from where we are to where he sees as the beginning, right? And maybe his teachings are not the most helpful in helping us bridge that gap.
Yeah. There's a saying that a person could be sitting on the top of a mountain and he can be shouting out a description of what he experiences from the top of the mountain, the view he has from the top of the mountain. But that's not necessarily going to be really helpful to people who are climbing the mountain. What he needs to offer, or someone needs to offer, is instructions about where they are in their progress up the mountain. That, watch out for this rock, watch out for this avalanche, go over this way, and so on. That's what's actually going to get them to enjoy the same view that the guy at the top of the mountain has.
Yeah. And that's the role for teachers like you and me and many people who have come to your podcast, is we try to bridge that gap. We understand those high standards and we are moving towards them, but we understand that people need so many things before they can start doing that.
Yeah. And it's nice to have the high standards too, because you want to have a vision of what's actually possible. That's inspiring. But there are different teachings for different levels of development, and those are relevant too. All right, I think we've covered that point. Now, this is an interesting little section of points here. Non-sectarian spirituality. And the first point in that is, do all paths really lead to the same goal? And I've had this discussion a lot with some friends, Dana Sawyer among them, who's been on Batgap a couple times. You know, if you got Jesus and Buddha and Krishna and Ramana and all these greats into a room together to have tea and have a chat, would they actually realize that they were all experiencing the same thing? What do you say to that?
I think that at least for me, but perhaps for many of us, we have always had this idea that all of these teachings are different paths to the same end. But after 2 decades of spiritual search, I'm questioning myself, like, is it really so? Is it really that the difference is only because the explanation that they give is that different teachers have different temperaments, or they are speaking to people of different temperaments, or they come from different cultural backgrounds, and that is what colors the different explanations that they give about the path, the goal, the practice. But looking deep into these things, it doesn't seem to me that it is the case. Just giving one small example, Ramana and Shankara said that to keep a body, however subtle, is to throw a veil of ignorance on reality. Right? So for their point of view, a fully realized master has really dissolved it to the self and does not exist as an individual in any level, anywhere in the cosmos. Right? Just disappear.
You mean once he's dead, or even while he's alive?
No, once he's dead, because that would be the final.
Okay,
yeah, he dropped his final body, and that drops all the bodies, and he doesn't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. So praying to Ramana wouldn't make sense because there is no Ramana there. So some force of the universe may respond, but not Ramana. So that seems to be what Ramana and Shankara and other Advaitins are saying. But you go to another lineage, let's say the lineage of Babaji and Lahiri Mahashaya and Yukteswar, and you see that they speak of the master leaving the body and continuing to do work in subtle levels of reality to help people around there. And then a master that is already completely realized taking another body to come and do more work in this world, etc.
Like an avatar or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm trying to understand this and see how all of this fits in the picture. So one option is these are 2 different things. Right? One of them is right, the other one is wrong. Or another option is no, they are different goals. Maybe the end of the spiritual journey for Advaita Vedanta is that complete effacement into the self. Maybe for many other paths, they don't want that, or they don't want that so soon. They want to stick around. And maybe the story of the Bodhisattva in Buddhism, right? They could become a Buddha and just dissolve in nirvana, but they choose to stick around and continue to play in existence.
I've probably spoken to maybe a dozen people who've actually had experiences with Ramana, in some cases before they ever even heard of him. And, then later on they saw a picture of him on a book or something. They said, oh, that was the guy that I saw, that came to me. So it might have been that Ramana got a surprise after he died and realized that he was still going to serve some kind of a role in creation. I don't know. But I think one thing on this point is that, sure, different paths might have different goals, but ultimately I think we would agree that there is some ultimate reality to the universe. And you can't have as many ultimate realities as there are paths, because then they wouldn't be ultimate. They would just be relative realities. And so theoretically, the highest spiritual teachings, whatever they might be, would all lead to that ultimate reality. And if they didn't, then they weren't the highest. They would lead to some relative degree of attainment. And although the different cultures in which those traditions arose might use different language to try to describe that ultimate reality, it would still be the same thing. And different beings might have different roles to play. Maybe some of them do dissolve like a drop into the ocean and no longer exist in any way, shape, or form. Maybe some retain some kind of form through which they can function. So that might just be an individual dharma thing, what your role is to play. But still, we come back to the point that ultimately there should be some ultimate reality, and that's what enlightenment is ultimately about, is the realization of that.
Yeah, so reality needs to be one, but maybe there are different. Maybe there's a choice as you're going about in the spiritual path. Like, do I want to just disappear into the eternal, or do I want to play in manifestation?
Yeah.
Because the eternal, the one without a second, is both Brahman and Maya. So do I want to, there's no way to, like, do I want to be just the Brahman, or do I want to continue being the Brahman but also in Maya? Maybe that's a choice that they have.
Yeah. Also, with regard to God, there's that choice. Do I want to be totally merged, or do I want to maintain some separation for the sake of devotion?
Mm-hmm.
That question is a traditional one.
Yeah. Because if I think that all of the spiritual path is for the ultimate goal of disappearing, that doesn't motivate me so much.
Yeah.
And some people may say, like, yeah, that's because you are attached to an ego. You want to continue existing as an individual. But then I say, like, is the universe in a hurry for us to awaken?
Mm.
I mean, if we look at the Vedas, before there was only Brahman, and then from time to time, Brahman manifests as the universe, and then it goes back to a time when there's only Brahman. So when it is manifesting in the universe, is it in a hurry that, okay, now there is illusion. Let's make sure that all these individual beings, let's make sure that the show finishes as quickly as possible. Is that the purpose? That doesn't make sense for me.
Yeah. It seems that the universe has a great deal of patience, and it's on a pretty big time scale. I mean, 13.7 billion years in this particular cycle of it. And it's said that there are numerous cycles and perhaps infinite universes. So it's a big picture. And in my experience and understanding, the ride is enjoyable. And I don't really sweat it in terms of, whether I'll cease to exist or whether I'll come back or whether there'll be some role to play on some level or other. It's like, leave it in God's hands and just do the best one can to be an instrument of that divine intelligence.
Mm. In this sense, I like the concept of Leela.
Yeah.
And I think that the Tantric tradition maybe got this a little bit more, in a way that is more appealing for most of us.
More than Advaita and Buddhism and all.
Yeah, because that is a bit more nihilistic. But in the Tantric tradition, the universe is the Leela of the Supreme. And if the Supreme just wanted to be the Supreme, it wouldn't have manifested at all. It doesn't manifest so that the manifestation finishes as quickly as possible. It's part of its nature to be just the Supreme and to as if manifest as a universe. And that's its Leela. And if we see it as Leela, then there's a lightness about it. And for me, it's much more motivating and it feels much different the way I approach the spiritual path.
I think that's a great point. That point inspires me. And it comes up fairly often in conversations here. Also, the notion of, God. I mean, if we look at the universe, any little bit of it, and consider what a marvel it is, how many atoms are in this glass and what's happening in each of those atoms and, and subatomic particles and the whole thing. I mean, if the whole thing were just random and accidental, which some materialists try to say it is, the second law of thermodynamics would have ground it to dust a long time ago. In fact, it never would have arisen. There's this notion of biocentrism, and there are about 200 different variables, any one of which, if it had been slightly off, like the strength of gravity or various other things, we wouldn't have had a universe, or we wouldn't have had any life in the universe. And yet, we do have a universe and life, and all these variables were perfectly tuned to enable that to happen. So that doesn't seem like randomness or accident. It seems like profoundly designed intelligence that has orchestrated this thing and set it up as in a way that we can barely comprehend.
Mm. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So a bit about meditation. Your book is called Practical Meditation, and you pretty much summarize all the different kinds of meditation that one might practice, and it's nicely illustrated, all kinds of cool stuff in here. So do you see, all the various meditations as being equal, or do you kind of see that different strokes for different folks, and that people are naturally going to gravitate to one form of meditation or another according to their inclinations, their nature?
Yes and yes, basically. I think that there are different ways of looking at all of these meditation techniques, and each of them, there are a lot of common benefits regardless of the technique you choose, but each of them has a different kind of taste and experience and different benefits also to it. So it depends on your personality. The meditation you would choose depends on your personality. It can depend even on things like, are you more of an auditory person, more of a visual person, or more of a kind of a body person? Because if you're more of a body person, you may really enjoy breath awareness meditation, and that may come so natural for you. If you're more of an auditory person, you may like mantra, which is a sound, or you may like nada yoga. If you're more of a visual person, you may like gazing, tratak. So there are many elements to choosing a meditation technique that is going to be the one that kind of flows better for you. And it also depends on what you need to develop the most at this time in your journey. So if what you need to develop the most is letting go of certain negative emotions, overcoming anger, being more empathetic and loving, opening your heart, then maybe the loving kindness meditation from the Buddhist tradition is the best one for you right now. If your mind is really, really messy and dissipated, I would say Tratak is really, really powerful for kind of uniting the stream of the mind.
The gazing one.
Yeah. So it depends on many things. And I would say that one meditation practice is not better than the others, just like one path is not better than the other. And unfortunately, I see a lot of this sectarian thinking out there. I see it in Zen, I see it in Vipassana, I see it in Advaita, I see it in TM. Like, this is the best, and the other ones, they're just longer, or they reinforce the ego or whatever. And I think that is a very narrow-minded way of seeing, and I think that misses the picture. For different people, you would need different practices. And so the best practice is the one that works for you at this moment in your journey. And 5 years from now, it may be different.
Yeah, I think there's a human tendency to sort of want to feel that what I am doing is the best, because if it's not the best, why am I doing it? I should be doing something else if something else is better. So it must be the best because I'm doing it.
Yeah, and you see, even the masters reinforce that.
They do.
Like Ramana says that self-inquiry and self-surrender are the superior techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And Yukteswar says that the Kriya Yoga is the best way to evolve.
And Yogananda said that Kriya Yoga was like an airplane, that could get you somewhere quickly. And then Maharishi Mahesh Yogi came along and said, well, yeah, fine, but TM is the jet plane. It goes faster than the airplane.
Yeah, so it's for me, it's like, why even the masters kind of indulge in this type of thinking? And I feel like, as you mentioned, there is some usefulness to that. Even there's some usefulness to dogma. If I am with the master and I am with the path, and he says like, this is the best path, the only way forward, the most effective technique, like, okay, I'm not going to think about anything else. I'm going to focus on this 100%, and I'm going to have better results. But if all techniques are equally good and beautiful and useful, which is kind of like what I'm pointing to, it may be that the person is like, doesn't know where to begin. So what I say is like, you have a period of experimentation that you are exploring, you're kind of going wide. And then you have a time that you're going deep. And ideally you would choose one path, one way, one practice, and stick to that. But you do that after you have experimented, after you have broadened your view.
Of course, the dark side of this is, when you get people who say, well, anybody who doesn't believe what I believe is an infidel and should actually be killed, if or converted, or those are the two choices, otherwise, and the whole world is going to eventually either be killed or converted, so it'll all be one thing. Those are the kind of extreme value of this line of thinking. Okay, then it's kind of useful to go through these notes because we're bringing out some things that I don't always talk about. You mentioned the word charging, presuming money. And some people say that nobody should charge for spiritual teaching, and others say, well, yeah, but you got to make teachers have to eat and pay the rent. And so what is your attitude toward that?
So in the beginning, I was very against charging anything for a spiritual teaching or even meditation. And little by little, I changed my mind about that. And that's why I started the blog. And I think there are some important points here to clarify. First is we can teach and practice meditation outside of a spiritual search, right? And there are many people who do that. And every time more in the West, especially for mindfulness and Vipassana, people are seeking meditation and they don't want all that spiritual, they don't want the spiritual path. They don't want the spiritual concepts. They just want to practice that will help them deal with anxiety. Like many people that come to me, that's what they need. And then, yeah, if I give them the practice and their anxiety will improve, they will manage it better or it may even disappear. Then they may be open to say like, okay, so what else is there? If this made such a difference in my life, like what else is there? Is it that those ancient yogis invented one thing that is a gem and everything else is rubbish? Or probably not. Probably there's some other gems in what they said as well. So if you think about what happened to yoga, in the past, it was the same thing. Like people would frown upon you teaching yoga. Like I'm talking about the asanas and being paid for it. But now it's just commonplace. Like, like, okay, if I want the yogas, I want the asanas, I'm going to pay for a studio, a teacher, someone that lives by doing that. And that's okay. If I go to a yogi in a cave, I probably don't need to pay anything. Right? But there are people who are paying for his life. There are people who are donating things for him. And the same will happen with meditation. We are still in that phase where people who are very traditional in meditation, like myself in a way, feel a bit off by charging for meditation. But if you're teaching, the first thing is if you're teaching meditation in a secular context, like as a tool of growth, of healing, of self-exploration, then you're not charging for spiritual teachings. Right? That's one thing. The other important thing is, let's say that this argument that you shouldn't charge for meditation and spirituality wins. Let's say that everyone is convinced by that. There are some people who are not going to be convinced by that, and it's people who are companies that are looking at these things simply as a profit. They will continue to promote and create apps and books and retreats and whatever, right? So if you convince everyone who is a true spiritual seeker that wants to dedicate his life to share these teachings and these practices, if you convince them to not do that because they shouldn't charge, they're going to have a job. And their ability to dedicate themselves to this is going to be severely diminished, right? And that is not in service of people, because the spiritual aspect of meditation will become smaller and smaller, because people who have a spiritual background will not want to charge for meditation. But people who don't have a spiritual background will look at meditation as a business. And what happens is that their version of meditation, that's going to be the one that gets spread. And I don't think that's good for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, back in the olden days, the monk would go around with his begging bowl, get enough food to eat, and there would be some support from the community for the ashram or where the monks lived, and they would teach, so there was a sort of socialism kind of support for them. These days in the West, teachers can't really do that, and they have rent to pay and maybe health insurance and food, all that stuff. So it's kind of silly in a way to just say, well, spirituality is about consciousness, and consciousness is a far cry from money, so there shouldn't be any money involved. But like everything else, it can be taken to extremes and abused and become a mercenary kind of endeavor. So again, students should probably use their discernment and discrimination and decide whether they feel comfortable with the way the whole money issue is being handled by a teacher that they want to get involved with.
Yeah, and I would say that the more that sincere teachers and seekers who have something to share, the more they are able to make a comfortable living, dedicating themselves fully to the teaching, the more the Dharma in all its versions will flourish. Right? And this is something that I learned only recently, but even in the Vedas, even in the ancient traditions, there's this idea that you should not get knowledge for free. Right? If there's a master, there's a teacher, someone giving you knowledge, giving you a technique, if they even have the idea that if you get it for free, it's not going to work.
Right. So there's the dakshina.
Dakshina, exactly. So dakshina, you can see it as a kind of an energetic exchange. From a psychological level, it makes sense. Like we don't value things that we don't pay for on many aspects. But the dakshina, so if you want to receive something that is so valuable from the guru, from the teacher, you need to give something back. And that something back could be money to help him pay his bills. It could be knowledge. It could be service in the form of seva. But you need to give something back. And nowadays, in our type of society, that's usually money, right? Which helps the teacher to continue to live and teach full time.
Yeah, it's a medium of exchange. You can't very well give them a cow.
It's not going to be so useful.
Okay, final topic, and then we'll wrap it up. A friend of yours named Daniel from Newport, Vermont, said, "Hey, Giovanni, it's your friend Daniel. Do you feel that occult practices and learning siddhis can help one transmit teachings of awakening, being able to really see someone to know what teaching or transmission of energy to give?" And I know that you yourself kind of started out with occult practices many years ago. And in your notes here, you say the spiritual taboo on psychic powers and their role in liberating science. So what do you have to say about all that?
Well, it's a big topic and it's controversial. But let me start by saying this. If you look at the Yoga Sutras, okay, 1/6 of all the verses in Yoga Sutras are about siddhis. Okay, and at that time, it was very difficult to write. They didn't have paper, right? So much so that Patanjali only wrote 204 verses. And he dedicated a big part of that to siddhis, how to develop them, etc. So siddhis have been a part of spiritual awakening and spiritual paths in many traditions. Right? Some people hate them and think that they're just distractions. Some people love them and seek them for what they are. And some people say like, no, they can be useful or they can be hindrances. Now, in the Yoga Sutras, verse 37 or 38, it says that these siddhis, they are obstacles to the mind in samadhi, but they are faculties to the exteriorized mind. Right? So when you are in samadhi, when you are in that deep state of union, right? And these siddhis appear, like you have a vision of your past life, or you start levitating, or whatever it is. If that appears in that state, it's a distraction. But for the exteriorized mind, the yogi does not live in samadhi all the time. He lives in the world. So when he comes out of samadhi, those siddhis, they are faculties. Right? They are things that he can use. And we see, just read the autobiography of a yogi from Yogananda.
Tons of stuff.
Or Living with the Himalayan Masters from Swami Rama. And you see that very advanced yogis and masters, they had siddhis and they did use them on certain occasions. Always for good things, not for entertainment, not for showing off, but for good things. So yes, I think as a teacher, if the teacher has the siddhi that he can look at the student and can understand everything that is going on in their life and can see the student deeply without the student needing to explain much, that can be very helpful. I have a friend that he's an ex-monk from a Tibetan tradition, and he says that in Tibetan Buddhism, it's considered that the perfect master would have all of these skills so that he can truly serve at a deeper level. So
certainly congruent with Christianity. I mean, Jesus had a bunch of different siddhis, according to
yeah. So that is one thing. Siddhis is something that can come on the path as you're practicing. They are something that can be purposefully sought after for a certain period of time. And if you do that, the skills that you develop in trying to practice to develop a siddhi, they will be helpful for other things in your path as well. But they should never be misused. And that's the big challenge. Once the person gets those siddhis, it's very easy to fall into the ego, to want to show off or to want to use that to fulfill other types of desires that should not be used for.
Yeah, you can go over to the dark side, like Darth Vader, and use them to strangle people or whatever. That's just what he did. But yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, have you ever experienced a siddhi or developed one?
I haven't developed Siddhi, but I have experienced some times in my life.
Temporarily.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Different things.
Yes.
Yeah. It's good we brought it up. Like you say, we could talk about it for a long time, and we don't have the time to do that. But it is there in pretty much every spiritual tradition, and it certainly was a big part of the Yoga Sutras. And the Buddha was reputed to have all kinds of different siddhis. And so it's a little bit simplistic, I think, to just brush it off as a distraction or an obstacle. It seems to have had its role, seems to have its role in higher forms of spirituality. So it's perhaps something to take seriously and to understand.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of a person coming to a yogi or a guru and saying like, I'm interested in practicing meditation only to have better memory, it's going to be useful in my life. The yogi is going to teach you meditation. He said, look, you're going to have better memory. You're going to have many other things, right? But another person comes to the yogi and say, I want to learn meditation so I can remember my past lives. Then suddenly it's like, shame on you. How dare you? Like, this is an obstacle, etc.
Yeah.
You know, it's not so different. It's a skill of the mind, and it's not the end goal. But if that's what is motivating a person to learn meditation and to be on the path, I would say, do it. Right? Just go for it. But at the same time, understand that this is only a small chapter of a larger story and a higher goal.
Yeah, which brings us back to a point we've made a number of times during this interview, which is that there's a value to knowledge. If you just really ponder this stuff and really think about it and dwell on it, which is one of the pillars of spiritual practice in many traditions, knowledge and dwelling, keeping your attention on this kind of thing. Everything kind of tends to fall into its proper context, and you don't overemphasize something to the exclusion of others. And so that's part of the reason I do these interviews. It's just sort of, it helps me to keep myself focused on knowledge, but it also, I think, helps the people who listen to them and broadens their perspective, hopefully.
Yeah, and before we finalize, I just want to touch on the topic of cities' role in liberating science. Our Western civilization and culture is heavily based on influence in science, and our science is very materialistic, right? If our science became more spiritualized, if it started studying the spiritual topics more, if it started opening up to that whole level of reality, then there would be so many positive benefits, so many areas like medicine, philosophy. It would be a huge benefit for society if science started to say like, look, there's actually more to our life than this body, and our actions matter, and there's karma. Imagine if that can be proved one day, and there's a past life, and we're actually more connected than we think. Some people can even read minds of each other. That will change the worldview little by little of millions of people.
Yeah. That's another of my favorite topics. And I gave a talk at the Science Non-Duality Conference in 2015 about that. You and I could go on another 2 hours about it, but we're not going to be able to right now. But it's a very important point. We live in a scientific age. Spirituality can really get science on the right track, and science can really help spirituality by giving it a more empirical, practical, systematic, verifiable orientation.
Mm-hmm. And once some advanced yogis that have these siddhis mastered, they decide to come up and to demonstrate this in scientific means, and then there's no explanation within science for what they're doing, that will force science to review some of its paradigms.
Yep, paradigms will have to shift. Okay, well, obviously I enjoy talking to you, and but we're going to have to conclude. So you have some kind of whole online meditation program, don't you, that people can go through in a step-by-step way and try various kinds of meditation and then hopefully find one that they want to stick with?
Sure. So for those that want to learn more, they can check Live in There, which is my website. And the program
I'll link to it from your page on that, yeah.
Yeah, and the program is called Limitless Life, and it's really for everyone that wants to start or deepen a meditation practice, but specifically focus on people struggling with anxiety.
Good. Okay, so I guess we're going to conclude now. you know, an interview can't be ever be as comprehensive as I would like it to be, because I would like to just sort of talk to you for 8 hours and really get into everything. But this is a kind of a sampling. It's a taste. And those who found Giovanni's points worthy of deeper exploration, I'll link to his website from his page on batgap.com. You can go there. There's some very interesting articles on his site to read. And you can sign up for his email newsletter, right? And be notified of webinars and so on. Buy his book if you want to. I'll have a link to that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Giovanni. So, and thanks to those who have been listening or watching. Next week, I'll be speaking with Danny Antman, and we're going to be talking about Kabbalah. And I don't think I've ever done an interview on that. So it's about time that I got around to doing one. So I'll see you then. Thanks.